He was 34 and had just been turned away again. Not with anger, not with a fight, just a quiet shake of the head, a closed door, and nowhere left to go but the road. With a worn Navy SEAL uniform, a loyal German shepherd by his side, and one last dollar in his pocket, he bought an abandoned riverboat landing office on the Mississippi River bluffs near Cape Girardeau. The dock had collapsed into the slow brown water years ago. The roof sagged where storms had torn through it. The county record said the building had been shut down since 1958 and marked for demolition that spring. No power. No road anyone still used, just wind, silence, and the sound of the river moving past like nothing had ever happened there. But what Ryan didn't know, what no one had known for decades, was that something inside that forgotten place had been waiting. And it wasn't just the building that was about to change. Before we continue, if stories like this stay with you, take a moment to subscribe and be part of this journey. A clear, late winter morning stretched across the Mississippi River, sunlight soft and golden, the air crisp and clean, as if the world had quietly decided to begin again. Ryan Miller stood at the edge of a quiet street in Cape Girardeau, shoulders squared out of habit rather than purpose, as if an invisible command still held his spine straight. He was 34, tall and powerfully built, the kind of man whose presence filled a space without effort. His jaw was sharply defined, shadowed by a rough stubble that had long outgrown the discipline of daily shaving. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, uneven now, as if trimmed by his own impatient hands. His blue-grey eyes, once sharp with mission clarity, carried something quieter now, something fractured, like glass that had been cracked but never shattered. He wore a full U.S. Navy NWU Type 3 digital camouflage uniform, the fabric slightly faded but meticulously clean. The boots on his feet were worn but polished, a silent refusal to let go of who he had been. Around his neck hung a pair of dog tags, cold against his chest, each step making them tap softly, like a reminder that some things never stop echoing. Beside him stood Max. Max was a large German shepherd, about 7 years old, with a strong, muscular frame and thick, black and tan fur that caught the morning light in subtle gold edges. His ears stood upright, alert, his posture calm but ready. His dark brown eyes held an intelligence that went beyond instinct. There was memory in them, and loyalty that felt almost human. A faint scar ran along his right shoulder, hidden beneath fur unless the light hit it just right. Around his neck was a worn military collar with a small metal tag that clicked softly when he moved. Ryan glanced down at him. Max didn't look back. He didn't need to. He simply stayed, always within reach, always close enough that Ryan could feel the quiet certainty of his presence. There had been a time when Ryan had pulled Max out of chaos, dust, gunfire, and a collapsing structure somewhere half a world away. The dog had been trapped, half-conscious, breathing shallow beneath debris. Ryan had carried him out without orders, without permission. It had been the one decision no one questioned. From that moment on, Max never left him. Now, months after discharge, it was Max who kept pulling Ryan out of something else. Not rubble, something heavier, something invisible. Ryan had tried to find a place in town, tried to rent, tried to explain gaps in paperwork that no landlord wanted to understand. Each rejection had been polite, almost apologetic. But the message was always the same. No references, no stable income, no exceptions. The last landlord had been a woman named Karen Whitlock, mid-50s, thin and rigid in posture, her short blonde hair perfectly combed, her expression caught somewhere between caution and discomfort. She had glanced at Max, then at Ryan's uniform, and then back at the application in her hand. "I'm sorry," she said, voice tight but controlled. "It's just not a good fit." Ryan had nodded. He didn't argue anymore. That night he slept outside the edge of town, under a sky so clear it felt unreal. Max lay pressed against him, sharing warmth without being asked. Ryan didn't sleep much. When he did, it came in fragments, broken images, flashes of sound, the kind that made his hands tighten even in rest. Each time, Max shifted closer, grounding him, pulling him back. Morning came like a quiet apology. It was later that day, inside a small public library with humming fluorescent lights and rows of outdated computers, that Ryan saw it. A listing buried among dozens of forgotten properties. County Surplus Demolition Sale, Pulaski County, former Riverboat Landing Office, abandoned 1958, scheduled for demolition, price $1. Ryan stared at the screen longer than he expected to. $1. It felt absurd. He leaned back slightly, rubbing his thumb along the edge of the desk. Somewhere deep inside, something stirred. Not hope, not yet, but something older, familiar. The same instinct that had once told him to move forward when retreat would have been easier. Max shifted beside him, resting his head lightly against Ryan's leg. Ryan exhaled slowly. "You see this?" he muttered, voice low. Max didn't respond, but he didn't move away either. The listing showed a faded image, a small wooden structure sitting above a river bluff, weathered, broken, forgotten. But something about it felt still standing. Ryan couldn't explain it. He had walked away from better options before, safer ones. But this didn't feel like a choice. It felt like a pull. He reached into his pocket. There was exactly $1 left, folded twice, edges worn soft. For a long moment, he just held it. Then he stood. 2 days later, after a bus ride that cut through long stretches of quiet farmland and a final walk down an unmarked dirt road, Ryan stopped. Max stood beside him, silent. Ahead of them, on a low bluff overlooking the slow brown curve of the Mississippi River, stood the building. It looked worse in person. The wooden planks were faded to a dull grey-red, the roof sagging in places, windows cracked or missing entirely. The porch leaned slightly as if tired of holding itself upright. Grass and weeds surrounded it, untouched for years. No sound, no movement. Just the river, whispering below. Ryan didn't step forward immediately. Something about the place pressed against him, not fear, not exactly. Recognition. Max took one step ahead, then paused, looking back at Ryan for the first time. Not waiting, checking. Ryan swallowed, then nodded once. "All right," he said quietly. They walked toward it together. When Ryan reached the door, his hand hovered over the handle for a brief second. The wood was cold under his fingers. Inside, something shifted. Not a sound, not movement, just a feeling. As if the building had been empty for decades. And yet, somehow, had been waiting. Ryan pushed the door open, slowly, the hinges groaning in protest as if the building had not been disturbed in decades, and the first breath of air inside carried the scent of old cedar, dust, and something faintly metallic, like time itself settling into the grain of the wood. Max stepped in first, paused silent against the worn plank floor, head low, ears alert, scanning corners with disciplined precision that no ordinary dog ever learned on its own. Ryan followed, each step measured, his body instinctively mapping exits, angles, blind spots, the habits of a man who had survived too many rooms where hesitation meant death. The light streamed in through broken windows, cutting long, pale lines across the floor, and for a moment it looked less like a ruin and more like something paused mid-breath, waiting to be remembered. He exhaled slowly, but his chest didn't fully release. It rarely did anymore. The silence pressed against him, and in that silence, memory began to creep in, uninvited and familiar. A flash of heat. The crack of something breaking, the sharp, metallic scream of twisted structure collapsing. Ryan's fingers tightened unconsciously, his knuckles whitening as his mind dragged him backward to a place he never fully left. Max reacted before the memory could take hold. He moved closer, pressing his body against Ryan's leg, grounding him with quiet insistence. Ryan blinked, forcing the present back into focus. "I'm good," he muttered, though his voice came out lower than he intended. Max didn't move away. He never did when Ryan said that. The memory came anyway, but softer this time, shaped by distance. It had been a collapsed communications outpost in a dry, hostile stretch of land where everything tasted like dust. Ryan had been moving through debris when he heard it, a low, uneven sound, not mechanical, not human. He followed it, ignoring protocol, ignoring the call to regroup. Beneath a slab of concrete and twisted metal, he had found Max, younger then, barely conscious, ribs rising shallowly under a coat matted with dirt and blood. There had been no time to think. Ryan had lifted him, carried him out under fire, not as an asset, not as a tool, but as something he refused to leave behind. From that day forward, Max chose him. Not out of training, not out of command, out of something simpler. Loyalty, earned in a moment when walking away would have been easier. Ryan moved further into the room now, boots creaking faintly. The interior stretched longer than he expected, a single wide space, empty except for a heavy wooden desk at the far end and a cast-iron stove sitting cold in the corner. The walls were panelled in faded green, peeling at the edges, and the ceiling sagged slightly near the back. It wasn't livable. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it wasn't nothing. He set his duffel bag down near the wall, the sound echoing more than it should have. Max circled once, then settled near the doorway, positioning himself where he could see both inside and out. Always watching, always ready. Ryan ran a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of his stubble. The weight of the place pressed on him, not just physically, but in a way he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt held, like something had been left here on purpose. He stepped toward the desk but stopped halfway. A sound, faint, almost imagined, shifted somewhere deeper in the structure. Not movement exactly, more like a subtle settling, wood adjusting against time. Ryan's body reacted instantly, shoulders tightening, breath slowing, senses sharpening. "Probably nothing," he said, under his breath. Max didn't agree. The dog stood, posture rigid now, eyes fixed toward the far wall behind the desk, his ears angled forward, every muscle alert. A low, almost inaudible rumble formed in his throat, not a bark, not a warning, but something in between. Ryan followed his gaze. The light shifted slightly as a cloud passed overhead, and for a brief second, the far wall darkened. Then the light returned, softer, diffused. Nothing moved, nothing changed, and yet Max didn't relax. Ryan stepped closer to him, placing a steady hand on the dog's neck. He could feel the tension beneath the fur, coiled and ready. "Easy," he said quietly, though his own pulse had begun to pick up. He looked back at the desk. Something about it drew his attention again, not the surface, but what was behind it. A faint outline on the wall. A shape that didn't quite match the rest of the paneling. Ryan frowned slightly. It could have been nothing, but nothing had ever felt quite like this before. The light thinned toward evening, turning the Mississippi below the bluff into a slow ribbon of bronze, and the abandoned landing office seemed to exhale the last warmth it had been holding, as the cold crept in through every crack in its aging frame. Ryan moved methodically, not because the place made sense yet, but because routine was the only thing that kept his mind from drifting into darker places. He checked the windows first, then the back corner, then the door again, his boots echoing softly on the worn planks. The structure was worse than it had looked from outside. The roof sagged noticeably toward the rear, and a section above the porch had a visible split where wind had forced its way in over years. No electricity, no running water, no insulation worth mentioning. It wasn't just abandoned, it had been surrendered. Max followed every movement, pacing slowly, his nails clicking lightly against the wood. As the temperature dropped, his breath became faintly visible in the air. He stopped near the doorway again, the same position he had chosen earlier, body angled outward as if guarding not just the building, but the space Ryan occupied within it. His ears twitched at distant sounds, the river, the wind, something shifting far beyond sight. But he never strayed far. Ryan dropped his duffel bag near the wall and pulled out a worn thermal blanket, folding it once before setting it on the floor near the cast-iron stove. The stove itself was rusted along the edges, its pipes slightly misaligned where it met the ceiling. He crouched beside it, running his hand along the metal surface, feeling the cold bite against his skin. "Not tonight," he muttered. It would take time to make it usable, time he didn't have yet. The sun dipped lower, the shadows lengthened, and with them the quiet grew heavier. Ryan sat down against the wall, pulling the blanket around his shoulders. Max approached without hesitation and settled directly in front of him, not lying down completely, but half-raised, alert, forming a barrier between Ryan and the open room. It wasn't trained behavior anymore. It was instinct shaped by memory. For a while, nothing happened. Just the wind slipping through broken seams in the walls and the distant low hum of the river moving through its endless path. Ryan focused on that sound, letting it anchor him. In, out, steady. Then it came. A sharp crack somewhere above. Ryan's body reacted instantly, muscles tightening, breath stopping mid-draw. His head snapped upward, eyes scanning the ceiling. Another sound followed, a faint shift, like weight redistributing across old wood. Max stood in the same second, no hesitation. His stance widened, ears forward, eyes locked upward, a low warning rumble building in his chest. "Easy," Ryan whispered, though his voice barely held. The memory hit faster this time, not a slow drift, an impact, the sound of collapsing structure, the pressure, the dust choking the air. For a split second, Ryan wasn't in the landing office anymore. He was back there. Back under weight, under noise, under something he couldn't outrun. His breathing broke. Max moved immediately. He turned, pressing his body hard against Ryan's chest, grounding him with force this time, not gentleness. The contact snapped something back into place. Ryan sucked in air, sharp and uneven, his hand gripping into the thick fur at Max's neck. "I'm here," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was telling Max or himself. The sounds above stopped. The building settled again into silence. Minutes passed before Ryan's breathing slowed. He leaned his head back against the wall, eyes closing briefly. "Not a great start," he muttered. Max didn't move away. He stayed exactly where he was, a steady weight, a living anchor. The cold deepened as night fully took hold. Ryan shifted, pulling the blanket tighter, but the chill still worked its way in through the floor, through the walls, through everything. Sleep came in fragments. Every small noise, wind, wood, distant water, pulled him back awake. Each time, Max adjusted, repositioning, always between Ryan and the rest of the world. At some point, Ryan considered leaving. The thought came quietly, almost rational. He could go back, find something easier, something with walls that didn't breathe and ceilings that didn't threaten to collapse. He opened his eyes, staring into the darkness. Max lifted his head, watching him. Not questioning, not urging, just waiting. Ryan exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said after a long moment. "I know." He didn't sleep after that, not really. But he stopped thinking about leaving. Morning came gradually, the first light filtering through broken glass and gaps in the walls, soft and pale at first, then growing warmer as the sun rose. The air shifted, losing its bite. The river below reflected the sky in muted gold. Ryan pushed himself up, stiff and sore, his joints protesting the cold night. Max stood immediately, stretching once before shaking out his fur. Ryan looked around the room again. In daylight, it didn't feel smaller, but it felt possible. The damage was still there, the work was still overwhelming, but it wasn't invisible anymore. He stepped toward the doorway, looking out over the bluff, the river stretching wide and endless under a clear sky. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was standing at the edge of something broken. He felt like he was standing at the start of something unfinished. Ryan nodded once, more to himself than anything else. "We stay," he said. Max didn't react. He simply walked past him, stepping out into the sunlight, as if the decision had already been made long before Ryan found the words. Morning settled gently over the bluff, sunlight slipping through broken window frames and stretching across the wooden floor in long golden lines, warming the cold silence, just enough to make the place feel less abandoned and more patient. Ryan didn't rush. He had learned long ago that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes had consequences that didn't forgive easily. He moved through the room with quiet intent, clearing debris, pushing aside broken planks, brushing layers of dust from surfaces that had not been touched in decades. Each motion was deliberate, controlled, his way of reclaiming space inch by inch. Max stayed close, shifting positions as Ryan moved, occasionally pausing to sniff the air, then the walls, then the floor, as if reading something invisible. When Ryan approached the far end of the room, near the heavy oak desk facing the river, Max slowed, his posture tightening again. Not fear, awareness. Ryan noticed. He always noticed. The desk was solid, surprisingly well preserved despite everything else around it. A roll-top design, old craftsmanship, the kind that had been built to last longer than the people who used it. Ryan ran his hand across the surface, pushing away a thin layer of dust. The wood beneath was smooth, still strong. He slid the roll-top open. Inside, time had stopped. A few scattered paper cards sat neatly in a wooden tray, their edges yellowed but carefully aligned. A chipped ceramic inkwell rested in one corner, dried long ago. 3 pencils stood upright in a small wooden holder, as if someone had placed them there at the end of a shift and expected to return the next morning. Ryan's chest tightened slightly. Not from fear, from something else. He turned slowly, following Max's line of sight toward the wall behind the desk. There, mounted at shoulder height, was a small wooden cabinet with 2 doors and a rusted brass latch. It blended into the wall so well it was almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Max stepped closer but didn't touch it. He simply sat, eyes fixed, waiting. Ryan reached out and tested the latch. The metal crumbled slightly under pressure, weakened by decades of neglect. It didn't resist, it simply gave way. The doors opened with a soft, hollow sound. Inside, 3 objects rested on a single shelf: a leather-bound book, a small tin box, and an envelope sealed with wax, tucked carefully behind them. Ryan didn't move for a moment. Something about the arrangement felt intentional, too deliberate to be forgotten, too preserved to be accidental. He took the book first. It was heavier than it looked, the leather worn but intact, the edges softened by time. The cover bore faint gold lettering, nearly faded away but still legible if you leaned close enough. Olmsted Landing Daily Log. Ryan sat down on the floor near the stove, the morning light falling across the pages as he opened it. The handwriting inside was small, neat, precise. Each line recorded something simple: boat names, arrival times, cargo, river conditions, day after day, page after page. It wasn't just a record, it was a rhythm, a life measured in quiet repetition. Ryan flipped through several pages, his brow furrowing slightly as he traced the entries. These weren't careless notes. Whoever wrote them had taken pride in every line, every detail. There was discipline here, order, a kind of calm he hadn't felt in a long time. Max shifted beside him, lowering himself to the floor, his body relaxing slightly for the first time since they entered the room. Ryan set the logbook aside carefully and reached for the tin box. It was plain, dented at the corners, its surface scratched from years of handling. When he opened it, the hinges creaked softly. Inside were bundles of old banknotes, stacked and wrapped with fragile paper bands that had begun to crumble. The currency was aged but unmistakable. Ryan stared. He didn't count it immediately. He didn't reach for it either. He just looked, his mind trying to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. After a moment, he exhaled slowly. "That's not nothing," he muttered. Max's ears twitched at his voice, but he remained still. Ryan finally reached in, lifting one bundle gently. The paper felt delicate, like it might fall apart if handled too roughly. He set it back down just as carefully. Then he picked up the envelope. The wax seal had cracked slightly with age, but it still held its shape. Ryan hesitated before opening it, his fingers resting along the edge. There was something about it, something that made the moment feel heavier than it should have. He broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, the ink faded but still readable. The handwriting matched the logbook. Ryan read in silence. The words belonged to a man named Calvin Pickering, a landing office pilot who had worked that very room for decades. The letter spoke simply. No grand language, no unnecessary emotion, just truth. He had saved a portion of every paycheck. He had hidden it here. He had no one to leave it to, so he left it for whoever came next. A small kindness, that's what he called it. Ryan sat very still after finishing the letter. The room felt different now, not empty, not abandoned, just quiet in a way that held meaning. Max leaned his head lightly against Ryan's arm. Ryan reached up, resting his hand against the dog's neck, fingers pressing into the thick fur. His grip tightened slightly, not out of tension, but something closer to grounding. "Guess we're not the first ones trying to start over here," he said softly. The river outside moved on, steady and indifferent. Ryan folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. Then he looked at the tin box again, then the logbook, then the room around him. For the first time since he arrived, the weight pressing on his chest shifted. Not gone, but lighter. Not because things were fixed, but because maybe they could be. By the third morning, the sun rose clean and bright over the river, the light warm against the cedar planks, but the work did not feel warm at all. It felt heavy, stubborn, and indifferent to effort. Ryan started with the roof, because it was the most urgent problem and the least forgiving. He dragged a warped ladder from the back of the building, tested each rung with his boot, then climbed with slow, deliberate care, every movement controlled. Up close, the damage was worse than it had looked from below. The shingles were brittle, some missing entirely, others curled and split, and the wooden frame beneath them had softened in places where water had been seeping in for years. This wasn't repair work. This was survival work. Max stayed below at first, pacing in tight circles, eyes tracking every shift Ryan made. He didn't bark, he didn't whine, but his body held tension like a drawn wire. Ryan pried loose a broken section of wood, the nail tearing free with a sharp crack that echoed across the bluff. He froze for half a second, old instincts, but then forced himself forward. He set the board aside, reached for another, and kept going. Sweat formed along his temples despite the cool air, slipping down past the edge of his stubble. Hours passed, his movements slowed, not from lack of discipline, from limits. Ryan had spent years in controlled environments, trained, equipped, backed by systems that ensured survival. This was different. There was no support here. No plan beyond what he could manage with his own hands. He shifted his weight slightly, reaching farther than he should have. The wood beneath his boot, gave a faint, warning creak. He ignored it. That was the mistake. The next step sank, not completely, but enough. The board split under pressure, his balance broke, and Ryan dropped hard against the slope of the roof. His shoulder slammed first, then his side, the breath knocked clean out of him. For a second the world went white. Max reacted instantly. He barked once, sharp, loud, not a warning, but a call, and bolted toward the ladder. Ryan didn't move, not because he didn't want to, because his body refused. Pain spread slowly from his ribs, tight and suffocating. He tried to inhale, but the breath came shallow, incomplete. "I'm good," he forced out, but the words barely made it past his teeth. Max didn't believe him. The dog circled once below the ladder, then looked out toward the road, the barely visible dirt path cutting through trees beyond the clearing. He hesitated for only a second. Then he ran. Ryan didn't see him go. Time blurred, the sunlight shifted, the wind moved through the broken edges of the roof, carrying the smell of river water and distant earth. Ryan lay where he had fallen, one arm braced weakly against the wood, his chest rising unevenly. He had been in worse situations, but he had never been alone like this. Minutes later, maybe longer, there was the sound of an engine in the distance. Faint at first, then growing louder as it approached the clearing. A pickup truck. It came into view slowly, bouncing over the uneven ground before stopping near the edge of the bluff. The driver stepped out first. His name was Daniel Dan Whitaker, a man in his early 60s, with a broad, weathered face and a thick grey beard that had grown uneven over time, as if trimmed with more practicality than care. He stood tall but slightly stooped at the shoulders, the posture of someone who had spent decades working with his hands. His skin was sun-worn, lined deeply around the eyes, and his gaze carried a cautious steadiness. He wore a faded denim jacket over a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms marked by old scars and new calluses. Dan had spent most of his life as a river mechanic, repairing engines for towboats along the Mississippi before retiring after a back injury forced him off the docks. Since then, he had learned to trust fewer people, but not to ignore a problem when it found him. Max jumped out of the passenger side before the truck had fully stopped, running straight toward the building, then back toward Dan, then forward again. Clear, urgent direction. Dan followed, quick despite his age. "Easy, easy," he muttered, though his pace didn't slow. He reached the ladder, looked up, and saw Ryan. "Well," Dan said under his breath, not surprised, just assessing. "That's not good." He climbed carefully, each step measured. When he reached Ryan, he crouched beside him without hesitation. "You hear me?" Ryan blinked, forcing focus. "Yeah." "Good. Means you're not out cold. Don't move yet." Dan's voice was firm, calm, the kind that didn't allow argument but didn't need to. Max stood below, watching, silent now, waiting. Dan checked Ryan's breathing, then his shoulder, pressing lightly along the ribs. Ryan winced, but didn't pull away. "Bruised," Dan said, "maybe cracked. Nothing shifting, though. That's lucky." Ryan let out a slow breath. "I've had worse." Dan gave a short nod. Most people who say that usually have. Together, slowly, carefully, they got Ryan down the ladder, each movement controlled, each step deliberate. When Ryan finally reached the ground, he leaned briefly against the side of the building, steadying himself. Max moved in close immediately, pressing against his leg again, grounding him. Dan stepped back slightly, giving space but not leaving. He looked at Ryan, then at the building, then back again. "You're the one who bought this place?" Ryan nodded once. Dan glanced at the roof, then at the broken structure around them. "That explains a few things." There was no judgment in his tone, just observation. Ryan exhaled slowly. "Yeah, still figuring it out." Dan studied him for a moment longer, then nodded again. You will, just not like this." Ryan didn't respond immediately, because for the first time since he arrived, someone hadn't turned him away. The days began to find a rhythm, not the kind that came easily, but the kind that had to be built slowly, like fitting broken boards back into place under steady hands and patient breath. Ryan woke with the light now, not because he slept well, but because the cold eased just enough at sunrise to let his body loosen. His ribs still ached when he moved, a deep, dull reminder under every breath, but the pain had shifted from sharp to manageable. He took that as progress. Max was always up before him, already alert, already watching the edges of the clearing, as if the world might shift if he looked away for too long. Ryan didn't climb the roof again. Not yet. Dan Whitaker had made that clear the morning after the fall, standing beside his truck with arms crossed, voice steady but firm. "You don't fix a place like this by trying to win against it," Dan had said, his grey beard catching the sunlight, eyes narrowed not in judgment, but experience. "You work with it, slow, or it'll put you back on the ground again." Ryan listened. Not because he liked being told what to do, but because something in Dan's tone carried weight, the kind earned over years, not claimed in words. So Ryan started smaller. He cleared the interior first, hauling out broken boards, sweeping layers of dust from the floor, setting aside anything that might still be used. Max stayed close, moving with him, sometimes stepping ahead as if checking the path, sometimes pausing near the doorway like a silent guard. When Ryan stopped, Max stopped. When Ryan worked, Max watched. By the third day, the place began to look less like something abandoned and more like something interrupted. That was when the second person came. Otis Brackman arrived without announcement, his old pickup truck rattling up the dirt path in a cloud of pale dust. He was a man in his early 70s, tall but slightly bowed with age, his back curved from decades of physical labor. His hands were large and rough, fingers thick and scarred, nails permanently edged with dark lines from years of working wood and metal. His face was narrow, weathered deeply by sun and time, and his white hair sat unevenly beneath a faded cap that looked older than some buildings. He stepped out slowly, eyes scanning the structure before settling on Ryan. "You're the one fixing this place," Otis said, voice low and gravelly, like it had been worn down over years of not saying much. Ryan nodded once. "Trying to?" Otis studied him for a moment, then shifted his gaze to Max, who stood still, alert but not aggressive. "Good dog," he muttered, almost to himself. He didn't ask permission. He walked straight to the side of the building, ran a hand along the damaged porch beam, then tapped it lightly with his knuckles. The sound told him what he needed to know. "Rot's not all the way through," he said. "You cut here, brace here, it'll hold." Ryan stepped closer, watching. Otis glanced at him briefly. "You know how to do that?" Ryan shook his head. Otis nodded once, as if that confirmed something expected. "Then you're going to learn." There was no offer, no formal agreement, just a decision made without ceremony. They worked in near silence. Otis showed him how to measure twice, how to cut clean, how to set a support so it carried weight instead of just covering damage. Ryan followed each instruction carefully, his movements precise, absorbing more than just technique. He was learning patience. Max stayed close to both of them, shifting between positions, occasionally lying down in the shade, but never fully relaxing. When Otis moved too quickly or stepped too close behind Ryan, Max's ears would tilt, body tightening slightly, not distrust, but awareness. Otis noticed once and gave a faint nod. "He's doing his job," he said. Ryan didn't disagree. Later that week, another figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. Lloyd Wickham moved slower than the others, leaning slightly on his left side as he walked, a habit left over from an old injury. He was in his late 60s, broad-shouldered but softened by age, his once powerful build now worn into something quieter. His hair was silver and thinning, his beard trimmed short but uneven, and his eyes held the distant look of someone who had spent years staring at open water. He wore a heavy canvas jacket and carried a wooden crate in both hands. He set it down without greeting, then straightened with a small grunt. "Figured these belonged here more than they did in my shed," he said. Ryan stepped forward, cautious but curious. Inside the crate were old river items, metal tags, worn tools, a small lantern dulled by time. Lloyd rested a hand on the edge of the crate. "Worked the river most my life," he added. "Not this landing, but close enough." Ryan nodded slowly. "Appreciate it?" Lloyd gave a brief shrug. "Don't need appreciation, just don't let it fall apart again." Then he turned and walked back toward his truck, his steps steady, but unhurried. By the end of the week, the landing office had changed, not completely, not even close, but enough that it no longer felt like it was waiting to collapse. It felt like it was holding. Ryan stood on the porch one evening, the sun dropping low over the river, the light warm against the repaired beams beneath his feet. Max sat beside him, body relaxed for once, watching the water move below. Ryan's ribs still hurt. His sleep was still broken. But the silence around him had shifted. It wasn't empty anymore. And for the first time in a long while, neither was he. Back by early autumn, the light over the Mississippi had changed, softer now, stretching longer across the bluff, as if the days themselves had learned to slow down, and the old landing office no longer looked like something abandoned, but something that had been waiting to breathe again. Ryan Miller stood behind the restored roll-top desk, sleeves of his U.S. Navy NWU Type 3 uniform rolled just enough to expose his forearms, the fabric still crisp despite the months of labor it had endured. His posture had changed, not the rigid, alert stance of a soldier anticipating threat, but something steadier, grounded. The sharp lines of his face remained, the stubble still rough along his jaw, but the constant tension behind his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet awareness instead of guarded distance. Max lay near the doorway, exactly where he had chosen to be on the first day, his large frame relaxed, but not careless. His coat, once dulled by dust and neglect, now carried a healthier sheen under the sunlight. The scar along his shoulder was still there, unchanged, but it no longer looked like damage. It looked like history. His ears shifted occasionally, tracking distant sounds along the river, but his breathing was slow, even. The kettle on the cast-iron stove let out a low hiss. Ryan reached for it without thinking, pouring hot water into a dented metal cup. The smell of coffee filled the room, simple and familiar. It had become routine now. Every morning, before the sun fully rose, he lit the stove and made a pot of coffee. Not because anyone asked him to, not because it was necessary, because someone once had. The letter from Calvin Pickering rested in the drawer beside him, folded carefully along its original creases. Ryan didn't read it every day anymore. He didn't need to. The meaning had settled into the structure of the place itself, into the way the light hit the desk, into the quiet moments before the world fully woke. A car approached from the dirt road, the sound carrying easily through the still air. Max lifted his head, alert but calm. Ryan glanced toward the window, then set the cup aside. The visitor stepped out slowly, closing the car door with a measured hand. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, a woman in her late 70s with a thin, upright frame, and a presence that carried both fragility and strength at the same time. Her silver hair was pulled back into a loose knot, strands escaping in the breeze, and her pale blue eyes held a clarity that came from a lifetime of remembering more than she spoke. Her skin was lightly lined, not deeply worn, but marked by years of quiet endurance. She wore a long wool coat despite the mild weather, buttoned carefully as if order mattered to her even when comfort did not. She paused at the edge of the clearing, looking at the building with a stillness that felt deliberate. Not curiosity, recognition. Ryan stepped outside, Max rising and moving to his side without being called. Eleanor approached slowly, her gaze never leaving the structure. "I wasn't sure it would still be standing," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It almost wasn't," Ryan replied. She gave a faint nod, as if that matched what she expected. "My father used to come through here," she said after a moment. "Towboat man, late 40s, early 50s. He used to talk about a man who worked this landing, said he made coffee before sunrise every day, whether anyone asked for it or not." Ryan felt the weight of the words settle. "Calvin Pickering," he said. Eleanor looked at him then, truly looked. "You found the letter?" Ryan nodded once. She stepped closer to the doorway, her hand brushing lightly along the wood frame as she passed. Inside, she paused near the desk, her fingers hovering just above its surface, not quite touching. "My father said places like this remember things," she murmured. "People think memory belongs to people. It doesn't. It stays in rooms, in floors, in the way doors open." Max moved slightly ahead of Ryan, watching her carefully, but without tension. Eleanor glanced down at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "You remind me of the dog my father used to talk about," she said. "Said there was always one on the docks, always watching." Ryan didn't respond. He didn't need to. They stood in silence for a while, the kind that didn't ask to be filled. The river moved below, steady as ever, carrying everything forward without pause. Eleanor finally turned back toward him. "You're doing right by this place," she said. Not praise, not approval, just a statement. Ryan looked around the room, the repaired beams, the cleaned floor, the desk that no longer felt abandoned. Then he glanced down at Max, who had returned to his place near the doorway, settling back into quiet watch. "I'm trying," Ryan said. Eleanor nodded once, as if that was enough. She didn't stay long after that. She left the way she arrived, quietly, without ceremony. When the sound of her car faded, the silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Ryan stepped back inside, picking up the cup of coffee he had set down earlier. He leaned lightly against the desk, looking out through the open doorway toward the river. Max remained where he was, eyes half closed now, resting, but never unaware. Ryan exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing in a way that no longer felt temporary. He thought about the moment in the past when he had lifted Max from beneath broken concrete, choosing not to leave him behind. He thought about the moment on the roof when Max had run, not away, but toward help. Two decisions, two directions, same outcome. Ryan took a sip of coffee, the warmth steady in his hands. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something he had to survive. It felt like something he could stay for. Sometimes the miracle we're waiting for doesn't arrive as a sudden change. It arrives quietly through a place, a moment, or a soul that refuses to leave us behind. Ryan thought he had lost everything, but God had already prepared a path hidden in an abandoned place, carried through the loyalty of a dog, and revealed through the kindness of strangers long gone. Maybe in your life, things feel broken, delayed, or forgotten, but nothing is wasted in God's plan. Every loss, every detour, every lonely night, it may all be leading you to the place where your life truly begins again. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Comment, Amen, if you believe that God is still working behind the scenes, even when we cannot see it. And don't forget to subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories that remind us all, no matter how lost we feel, we are never truly alone. May God bless you, guide your path, and bring peace to your heart today and always.